Hi there, my name is Alexandra and I'm a landscape artist based in New England, and today I'm going to be sharing with you 5 different ways that I learned over the last week to help improve my art while I was working on a project of painting every day. This was a piece that I did before I started the project, a few days before, which is a line and wash piece of Pemaquid Point in mid-coast Maine. It's very typical of the way that I used to do watercolor and gouache painting and that I liked, but I was interested in improving upon and moving into a more loose paint-oriented style rather than a line and wash combination. You can see that it's all transparent washes, and the color work is rather simple and the values are not super high contrast. It's really the line work that's supporting this painting. And I liked it, but it also took quite a lot of time to do all of the line work in the rocks and to demonstrate the shapes through that. And then by the time that I came into the wash, I was really nervous about ruining it. I also wanted to develop a watercolor and gouache style that would support me in doing plein air studies for oil painting. I wanted it to look more like an oil painting, and also for the thinking and process to be closer to an oil painting. I was really inspired by James Gurney's YouTube channel and his style of working with gouache and watercolor, which I think really evokes the same system and mentality as oil painting. So I decided to finish this sketchbook by painting every day, and I had quite a lot of pages left. During that process, I learned a couple of interesting things that helped me to not overwhelm myself, but still improve from painting to painting and to come to my paintings with a learning mindset. So this was where we started beforehand, and then you'll see quickly how we evolved over the next week or so. On this first piece, which is from Damariscotta, nearby Pemaquid Point in mid-coast Maine, from my recent trip, I took these photos. There's no line work going on at all here, actually. There's a little bit of underdrawing, which was rather sloppy, to be honest. I was really happy with some of the details, like with the window cases and the signs. I thought that was really interesting, and I also felt like I had a lot to improve in terms of my architectural drawing and how I represented the bricks. I wasn't super happy with that. But what I learned from this is that I needed to find something to improve that was concrete. So I would look at things that I liked, and I looked at things that I didn't like, and instead of evaluating the piece as whether I liked it or not, or whether I felt like it was up to my standard or not, especially in a new way of approaching a medium, I looked for specific things that I could improve. And then I took notes of those. So I felt like the architectural drawing was sloppy, and that became distracting and difficult to fix later on. I wanted it to be tighter as an architectural drawing so that I could then have looser brushwork rather than having to have the brushwork compensate for irregularities. Then I also was really strict with myself about including at least one more thing that I liked about the painting rather than just things to improve. And that helped keep me from getting demoralized as I continued on. I really liked this painting, especially at the time. I loved the high contrast of the values and the story that seems to be unfolding as the trees lean out towards the open bay. This whole section had to be reworked several days later because I absolutely hated the tree. I didn't actually save footage of what it looked like before, but you can still kind of see where there was the previous tree. Shadows and the value in that tree were really choppy. By the time that I was further along in the week, I was better at wet on wet washes that captured the difference in values without having this wet on dry puddling effect. And so I came back and I reworked this in gouache later. That also meant that the seascape back here, which was relying on the white of the paper, ended up becoming a little bit muddier with the introduction of the opaque gouache. I really liked how I included watercolor pencil to create drawing effects and not necessarily hiding that was watercolor pencil. I liked using the watercolor pencil to create pops of light in the window to reflect the sunlight on the foliage nearby. I also felt like I had improved concretely in terms of my architectural drawing from the previous one, and so I felt that I had made real progress. Having something concrete to then work on in the next piece made it easier to see that I was improving, even if there were things I still wanted to work on. I still felt really lost with using, sort of taking things that I'd learned from James Gurney's method and how he approached a whole watercolor painting, since previously my watercolor paintings were, as I said, wash-oriented, very transparent, and also inspired a lot by the single layers of color used by Chinese and Japanese watercolorists. Now I wanted to move to a more oil painting and layering technique that involved more opaque pigments. So what I ended up doing was putting on one of James Gurney's videos where he follows his painting really closely and you get to see it progress, and just following it as the video continued. I noted that he had a color underneath, a base color, and then seeing his big washes and bleeding together of colors really inspired me to be much looser and assertive with my colors, and to then work on top of that and on top of that again. He also let more layers dry in between and did a lot more detail work, but I didn't hold myself to needing to create a final painting that I was happy with, because I was mainly interested in his approach. Here you can see that I experimented more with the drawing. My trees are still kind of, I don't know, tight. I wasn't sure how to represent these spindly branches, and so I was experimenting with new ways of handling them. I also implemented some more of James Gurney's technique of having these gestural brushstrokes to represent leaves. I would think that at this point I was starting to understand how better to approach the painting as with a paint mindset rather than with a drawing mindset. Here's the first painting that I did plein air of this set. I used the background color again. I realized at this point that I was actually liking my architectural work better than I was liking my foliage, which I saw evolving earlier on, but I have always felt kind of intimidated by buildings and more comfortable with trees, and so that was really shocking. As my architectural work got better, my foliage and tree work was not keeping up, so I knew that I had to put intentional work on this. I wasn't sure how to represent the distance back here, and I learned that I wanted to have more space in the painting, and also how to represent the various pockets of dark values and light values alternating and creating more broad value zones. At this point in the process, I really knew I needed to make a commitment to continuing to turn up, to continuing to paint, whether that was every day or every other day, to just create, because since this was all very new, a new way of approaching a medium, I was feeling a little bit discouraged because I wasn't producing the results that I was hoping or expecting of myself. I didn't understand how to approach familiar problems such as bare trees in a medium that I wasn't as comfortable with, and approaching it in a new way. But I knew that if I continued to turn up and continued to improve on my work, I would find solutions that I liked. And here's where we start to see the results of that. This is another plein air piece that I did. It's another early spring scene. I think there might be a background color in here of a light yellow, but it wasn't as strong of a color. And I realized that that was something that I liked more because I'm still using watercolor and gouache rather transparently. I felt so much happier here with this eccentric tree trunk and following out the branches to give them personality instead of avoiding them and feeling nervous about them. But then I also wanted to create more depth. I liked the sense of light coming behind these leaves, but I felt like the background didn't feel like it was very far behind the rest of the painting. I also felt much more confident with my ability to handle structural elements, such as this bench. On this day, I realized how much I was relying previously on my ideas of trees and branches and less on how the branches and trees actually looked. It became important to me to spend much more time looking at the subject and capturing what was really there. Because I'd previously felt comfortable with trees, I'd settled into symbols of trees and how I was representing them that I was no longer satisfied with. At this point, I started experimenting with having different color reels. Because I was feeling more confident with how to approach the painting, I was able to experiment more in the beginning and have more of a strategy going in. Here I realized that I needed to create space through the painting by having a route that the eye is supposed to travel along. But instead of just letting myself get hung up that I'd spent part of my day on what I felt was a terrible painting, I found things that I really did like. I liked the skyline a lot. I think that those foliage shapes were really good. And I also had put a lot of effort into trying to figure out what the value of these shadows in between the trees really were. Now, I don't know that it works as an overall composition, but I do think I was successful in identifying this value and in creating this skyline. So I just found things that I did like, and then I found a couple of concrete things that I needed to move on. Instead of saying I didn't like this one or it was a bad painting and beating myself up about it, I found concrete things that I could work on next time. Here I was struggling to create more depth, but I was experimenting more, which was great. I also feel so much more confident in my branches and in my sense of trees. And I think you can see James Gurney's influence from the master study that I did in terms of these leaf layers in the opaque gouache, leafy, blossomy layers that are happening up here. I felt really proud of especially this overhanging branch bit, but I still wasn't sure on how to create depth in the background. So I knew that I had to continue to experiment. And since I felt like the value blocks weren't clear, I knew that I needed to put more work into simplifying the values in the compositions so that they supported each other and supported my objective of creating distance into the background. As I said, I needed to spend more time planning beforehand what the composition was going to look like. So I did a little sketch here. And I also realized at this point that I needed to spend more time in play and experimentation before I went into the painting. I played here with all my different greens and watercolors, not all of them that I can make, but so many, and also how to utilize a bunch of different ways of muting the greens down. Then by the time that I approached this painting, I already had a sense of how it would work in terms of values, in terms of drawing, and also some new greens to play with and experiment with that translated directly into the painting. I feel like the composition here is much stronger, the architectural drawing is miles better than it was in that first painting, and I think that my sense of depth here is starting to emerge by introducing perspective and having a clearer strategy in terms of values and color. The sense of the street going backwards past the church is much more obvious. I still wasn't super happy with the foliage around these bushes, but I also didn't let myself linger on that because I was trying so hard to create the sense of depth that I didn't want to try and tackle too many things at once. Oh, I really like this one. I think this is maybe my favorite of the whole week. I love also the experimentation that I worked on. I did multiple value sketches, one in pencil and then one in pen, which I found more helpful. I did a lot of experimenting with these cooler greens and then also experimenting with the ways that colors run together so that I could rely more on wet on wet washes to create interesting mixes of color in between. I didn't actually use this wet on wet technique as much in this painting, but it became a stronger part of the paintings moving forward. It's almost as if the painting where I'm trying to apply a new technique isn't the one where it works, but it's the one after that or one past that where I'm able to effectively employ it. I do think that I was successful in creating much more depth here. The cooler trees behind and the warmer sunlit areas helped to create a sense of depth, and also the smaller architectural elements. I was also really proud of how I simplified this scene, and I like the sense of atmosphere. One of my favorite artists is Thomas Aquinas Daly, and I have his book Painting Nature's Quiet Places, and he was one of the first artists that I ever learned about because he was one of my mom's favorites as well. And I think I can see how inspired I still am by him. I love this book. I don't know if it's still available in print, but I definitely see a correlation between his work and the work that I've been on this piece. Here I experimented with more purples, which wasn't actually part of my objective in this painting, but I did rely on it for how I created the Japanese maple leaves and the trunk of the tree. I feel so much prouder of my spindly long trunks and trees reaching out towards the sunlight. I worked hard on creating more of a root through the painting here, having the trees lean and the values and foliage point you in different directions, but I'm not actually sure that I like the way that I worked the bird feeder, and that's okay. At this point, I was so in the flow of painting regularly that I was enjoying just turning up and being in my sketchbook, experimenting with texture and colors, and then applying those experimentations to the paper. This one was interesting because I relied so much more on wet applications of the watercolor. It's a much more transparent piece, and so it was interesting to come back to watercolor with the knowledge I had gained from my experiments with more opaque methods. I felt much more comfortable doing the architectural drawing in the background, and I didn't want it to feel necessarily too structural, but just a bit of a keyhole peep through. I do wish that I had preserved the values of my little thumbnail, and surprisingly this piece has much less of the playful prep work, but I think that the risk-taking that I was doing here was really good. And then here's the last piece. Ironically, this is actually not one of my favorites, and I think it was obvious to me at the time why. Because it was the last page in the sketchbook, I felt a lot of pressure to have it be really good, that I had made concrete improvements and felt really proud of my last piece as like a summary or a final exam of everything I had learned in the sketchbook. I really like the value study that I did in the beginning. I really relied on this to try and pull the painting through, and you can see I did a many layered exploration of this scene before I even started the painting. I had worked over this maybe 3 times, and the fact that I wasn't super happy with any of them probably should have informed me that I wasn't going to be super happy with this, but I powered through anyway. I think the main takeaway here was feeling timid and tight is going to result in a timid and tight painting. But I do think, even though this isn't my favorite, I feel so much more confident approaching watercolor and gouache to do architectural work, to be painterly, and to experiment than I did before. Where if we move back here, I wasn't even thinking about the paint in the way that I was at the end. Surprisingly, I actually even preferred using watercolor and gouache to do some life drawing. When I went to a life drawing class, I started with drawing materials, but I ended up feeling more comfortable with the watercolor and gouache. I just used it to shape around the figures, to correct things, and to create different values. And this is so unfamiliar to me. I feel like a brand new person. So thanks for coming for my sketchbook tour. I hope it was helpful. I hope you're feeling encouraged, and I'm excited to show you my next sketchbook as soon as I'm done with it. All right then, take care. Bye.